The locker door clicked shut with a metallic finality that seemed to suck the air right out of the room. I froze, my hand hovering over my gym bag, caught in the act of doing the one thing I swore I wouldn't. In the fogged mirror, Sloane's eyes met mine. She wasn't moving. She was just watching me watch her. It wasn't a look of professional analysis or post-match fatigue. It was hunger. Pure, terrifying hunger. We were doubles partners, 3 matches away from a national title, and the silence stretching between us suddenly felt heavier than the gold medal we were chasing. The air in the locker room was thick, heavy with the artificial scent of eucalyptus, pumped in to mask the sharper, more honest smell of adrenaline and sweat. It was a humid, suffocating heat that usually helped me decompress, but today it felt like the walls were closing in. I moved through my post-match routine with the kind of rigid precision that usually kept me sane. Towel on the bench, perfectly aligned with the seam of the wood, water bottle placed exactly 3 inches to the right. I was building a fortress of small actions to keep the chaos of the last 2 hours at bay. Sloane, on the other hand, was a storm. She dropped her paddle bag onto the floor with a careless thud that echoed against the tile. She sat down on the bench opposite me, legs sprawled, occupying more space than she physically needed. That was Sloane. She lived in the margins, pushing boundaries until they bent to her will. On the court, that chaotic energy was our greatest weapon. She was the fire to my ice, the explosive power that cleared the net while I calculated angles and spin rates. But here, in the quiet aftermath, her presence was a disruption I didn't know how to strategize against. I could feel the residual hum of the match in my muscles, a low-grade vibration of fatigue and exhilaration. My skin felt tight, salt drying on my neck, hair plastered to my forehead. We had won, scraping by in a tiebreaker that had forced us to move as a single organism, anticipating each other's thoughts before they fully formed. But the high of the win was curdling into something more volatile. Every time she shifted on the bench, the rustle of her gear sent a spike of awareness through me. I kept my eyes on my shoelaces, untying them with deliberate slowness, terrified that if I looked up again, the mask I'd spent months polishing would crack wide open. The locker room at the club is designed to be a sanctuary, all slate gray tiles and soft ambient lighting. But right now, it felt like a pressure cooker. The steam from the showers drifted into the changing area, thickening the air until breathing felt like inhaling warm water. Every drop of water dripping from a faucet sounded like a gavel striking a desk. I focused on the mechanical process of cooling down. I unzipped my gear bag, the sound distinct and harsh. I took out my foam roller, placing it parallel to the bench. I was the strategist. I was the one who knew the wind speed, the court surface geometry, the precise probability of a drop shot clearing the net. Control was my currency. But Sloane was bankruptcy waiting to happen. She had kicked her shoes off immediately, leaving them where they landed, one overturned, laces trailing like dead snakes. She was leaning forward now, elbows on her knees, head hanging low as the adrenaline crash hit her. I watched her from the periphery of my vision. Her shoulders were heaving slightly, the muscles in her back defined and tense under the thin material of her kit. We were both wrecked. The match had been a brutal, physical grind, a 2-hour war of attrition under the midday sun. My quads were burning with a dull, throbbing ache, and the skin on my palms felt raw from gripping the paddle handle as if my life depended on it. Usually, this was the time we debriefed. We would dissect the opponent's weaknesses, analyze our unforced errors, and plan the dinner logistics. But today, the silence was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest. I couldn't ask her about the tiebreaker. I couldn't talk about the drive home. The memory of the mirror was too fresh. I had let the mask slip. For a split second, I hadn't been looking at my doubles partner. I had been looking at the woman who had spent the last 6 months slowly dismantling my defenses without even trying. "You're quiet," Sloane said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, delivered with the casual intimacy of someone who knew exactly how rare my silence was. She turned her head, looking at me properly now. Her hair was a mess, strands sticking to her cheeks, and her eyes were dark, dilated, unreadable. Usually by now you've told me 3 things I did wrong and 1 thing I did right. I didn't have a critique today, I admitted, zipping my bag shut. The sound was sharp, a zipper tooth rhythm that cut through the steam. That was the problem. It was a half-truth. Technically, her game was never clean. It was messy, violent, and brilliant. A stark contrast to the way I operated. We are a paradox on the court, a friction that somehow produces fire. I am the architect of our points. I view the court as a grid of probabilities, a chessboard where every move is calculated 3 steps in advance. I live in the non-volley zone, that 7-foot strip of concrete where the game slows down to a battle of millimeters. I deal in soft hands, in the dink that drops dead just over the net, in the patience required to wait for the other side to blink. I suffocate opponents with precision, narrowing their angles until they have nowhere left to go. Sloane doesn't have the patience for suffocation. She wants the knockout. She plays from the baseline with a terrifying velocity, turning defense into offense with a flick of her wrist. She is all instinct and fast-twitch muscle fiber, a chaotic element that refuses to be graphed. When I set them up, she knocks them down. It works because we cover each other's blind spots, but it also means we exist in a constant state of high-wire tension. We spend hours standing inches apart at the kitchen line, toes right up against the white tape, occupying the same breathing room but forbidden from crossing into the zone. It is a forced intimacy, a physical partnership that requires us to move as if we are tethered by an invisible rope. We have to know where the other body is without looking. We have to trust the space will be filled. Today, that tether had pulled tight. It was the second set, the score locked at 9-all. The opponent sent up a high, desperate lob that drifted toward the center line. It was my ball. I called it. "Mine!" I shouted, stepping back to take it out of the air. But Sloane didn't hear me. Or maybe the adrenaline drowned out the logic. She crashed into my space, her eyes fixed on the yellow plastic ball against the blue sky. We collided. It wasn't a gentle bump. It was a full-body impact. Her shoulder drove into my chest, knocking the wind out of me. For a fraction of a second, the game stopped. I felt the solid, heated weight of her against me, the damp friction of her jersey against my bare arm, the sheer density of her muscle. We didn't pull away immediately. That was the error. In the middle of the court, with the sun beating down and the crowd watching, we stayed tangled for a heartbeat too long. I smelled the specific mix of her sunscreen, something like coconut and zinc, and the sharp salt of her sweat. I felt the rapid hammering of her heart against my side. Then she laughed, a breathless, jagged sound, and pushed off me to slam the ball for a winner. "Sorry," she had yelled over her shoulder. But she didn't look sorry. She looked exhilarated. She looked like she had just gotten exactly what she wanted. That impact had cracked something open. The rest of the match, we played with a terrifying synchronicity, but the air between us had shifted. We weren't just partners anymore. We were 2 bodies that had remembered what it felt like to touch. Now, in the locker room, that memory was vibrating in the silence. I stood up, slinging my bag over my shoulder. The strap dug into my tired trapezius, a grounding sensation. "I'm heading out," I announced, needing to escape the humidity and the stare she was still directing at my back. "My car's in the shop," Sloane said. She didn't look up from her untied shoes. She just threw the words out like a lure. "Alternator died this morning. I took an Uber here." I paused at the door. The smart play was to let her call another Uber. The smart play was to keep the containment field intact. But I was tired of being smart. I was tired of the geometry. "I'm driving right past your place," I said, the words slipping out before I could calculate the risk. Sloane looked up then, a slow smile spreading across her face that told me she knew exactly what game we were playing now. "Perfect," she said. Stepping out of the club and into the parking lot felt like walking into a different world. The sky had bruised over, turning a deep, violent purple, and the first heavy drops of rain were beginning to slap against the pavement. By the time we reached my car, the drizzle had turned into a deluge, blurring the sharp lines of the parking lot into a watercolor smear. I unlocked the doors, the lights flashing a welcoming amber, and for a second, I hesitated. Once we got inside, the dynamic would change again. The open air was a buffer, The car was a capsule. I slid into the driver's seat, the familiar scent of conditioned leather and faint vanilla grounding me. But then the passenger door opened, and Sloane slid in, bringing the storm with her. The door thudded shut, sealing us inside, and the sudden silence was deafening. The world outside was reduced to a rhythmic, muffled drumming against the roof, a relentless percussion that made the space inside feel microscopic. My car is a mid-sized sedan, designed for efficiency and comfort, but with Sloane inside, it felt like a two-seater. She adjusted the seat back, her knees angling toward the center console, effectively erasing the neutral zone between us. I pressed the ignition, and the engine purred to life, the vents immediately blowing warm, dry air to fight the creeping fog on the windshield. It did little to dissipate the thickness in the cabin. Sloane smelled like rain-dampened cotton and that lingering, sharp tang of competition, a scent that was usually reserved for the court, for the high-stakes environment where we made sense. Here, in the dark intimacy of the vehicle, it felt stripped of its context. It was just the smell of her skin, distinct and unavoidable. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the cool, smooth surface under my palms. It was my anchor. "Buckle up," I said, the command automatic, a reflex of my need for safety protocols. Sloane pulled the belt across her chest, the fabric rasping against her jacket. "You drive like a grandma, I'll be fine," she teased. But her voice lacked its usual bite. It was lower, softer, vibrating in the small space. I pulled out of the lot, merging into the slick, dark traffic. The wipers swished back and forth, a metronome counting down the seconds of this strange, suspended reality. I needed to fill the silence. I needed to drag us back to the familiar ground of strategy and statistics. "That overhead in the second game," I started, keeping my eyes fixed on the red taillights ahead. "Your footwork was lagging. You were planting on your heels." Sloane turned her head toward the window, watching the rain distort the streetlights. "We won the point, didn't we?" "We won the point because their return was garbage," I countered, tightening my grip on the wheel until my knuckles turned white. "If we play the team from Florida next week, that lag is going to cost us the set. You need to stay on the balls of your feet." "I need you to stop coaching for 5 minutes," she said. She didn't sound angry. She sounded tired. "We aren't on the court. The game is over." "The game is never over," I muttered. But I let the conversation die. She was right, and that was the problem. If we weren't talking about pickleball, what were we talking about? The silence that settled over us wasn't empty. It was viscous. It was filled with the memory of the locker room mirror and the heat of her shoulder against my chest. I went to shift gears, my hand dropping from the wheel to the stick. The movement brought my knuckles within an inch of her knee. She was wearing shorts still, having only thrown a jacket over her kit, and the proximity of her bare skin was a radiant source of heat. I could feel the warmth of her leg without touching it, a magnetic field that made my hand hesitate. I shifted quickly, jerking the car slightly, and returned my hand to the safety of the wheel at the 10-2 position. Sloane noticed. I saw the corner of her mouth twitch in the reflection of the glass, but she didn't say anything. She just shifted her leg, letting it rest against the side of the console, closing the gap by another millimeter. I should have turned right at the intersection. That was the way to her apartment complex, a sprawling, chaotic place that fit her personality perfectly. But the lane was blocked by construction cones, or maybe I just told myself it was. I stayed in the left lane, the blinker silent. "You missed the turn," Sloane said. She wasn't looking at the road. She was looking at me. "Traffic is backed up on 4th, I lied. The lie tasted like copper in my mouth. "And I have the raw footage from the match on my server at home. If we're going to fix your footwork, we need to see it." It was a flimsy excuse, a transparent, paper-thin rationalization for why I wasn't ready to let her go yet. I waited for her to call me out. I waited for her to laugh and tell me to turn around. "Okay," she said simply. "Okay?" I glanced at her. "Yeah, let's watch the tape." Her gaze held mine for a fraction of a second too long before she looked back out at the rain. "But you're pouring the wine." I'm not watching my unforced errors sober. My heart hammered a rhythm against my ribs that had nothing to do with cardio. We were deviating from the plan. We were driving past the boundaries we had set for ourselves, heading straight for the one place where I couldn't hide behind the net. I drove the rest of the way in silence, the car cutting through the storm, carrying us toward a different kind of collision. My key turned in the lock with a heavy, expensive thud. a sound of definitive separation from the outside world. I pushed the door open and stepped aside to let her in, a gesture that felt less like hospitality and more like surrendering a border. My apartment is a curated extension of my mind. Stark, gallery white walls and low, severe Italian furniture. There are no throw pillows, no knickknacks. It is a space designed for one person, a manifesto of order. And then there was Sloane. She stepped across the threshold, and the visual dissonance was immediate. Here, she was a chaotic element introduced into a sterile environment, a splash of neon paint on a blank canvas. Her sneakers squeaked faintly on the polished concrete floors, a sound that grated against the carefully engineered quiet I had spent years perfecting. She stood in the entryway, dripping water onto the charcoal slate mat, seeming afraid to touch anything, as if her very presence might leave a permanent smudge on the pristine reality I had built. "You can put your bag anywhere," I said, though anywhere was a lie. There was no place for a battered, sweat-stained paddle bag in this room. It didn't fit the aesthetic. It didn't fit the life I lived off the court. She set it down carefully on the floor, tucking it near the wall as if trying to hide it. It was a jarring spot of color against the monochromatic paint, a bruise on the perfect skin of the room. "Nice place," she murmured. Her voice was too loud in here. The acoustics of the apartment were designed for silence, for the soft hum of the HVAC and the turning of pages, not for the husky, resonant timbre of her voice. "It's clean. I like order," I replied, walking past her into the kitchen. The open-plan layout meant there was no escaping each other. I could feel her eyes on my back as I opened the cabinet, tracking my movement with the same intensity she used to track a ball. I took down 2 glasses, heavy crystal tumblers that felt substantial in the hand, and filled them from the filtered tap. My movements were precise, practiced. I was clinging to the ritual of hosting because it was the only script I had left. I turned back to hand her the water. She hadn't moved from the entryway. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, shivering slightly. The cold rain had settled deep in her bones, bypassing the muscles she worked so hard to build, finding the vulnerability underneath. "Come in," I said, softer this time, the command losing its edge. "Don't stand by the door." She moved then, walking slowly toward the living room. But she didn't sit on the pristine leather couch. She gravitated toward the floor-to-ceiling window. The rain was lashing against the glass, blurring the lights of the skyline into abstract streaks of gold and red. She stood with her back to me, staring out at the storm she had just escaped, looking like she was waiting for the glass to shatter. I watched her, stripped of the club's harsh sunlight and the locker room's fluorescent glare. Here, in the dim ambient light, she seemed smaller than she did on the court. The formidable rival who could drive a ball at 80 miles an hour was gone. In her place was a woman who was tired, cold, and displaced. A strange territorial instinct flared in my chest. This was my sanctuary. I had built these walls to keep the world out, to keep the messiness of human connection at bay. Seeing her here felt like a violation of that solitude. But beneath the territorialism was something else. A dangerous, magnetic pull. I didn't just want her out of my space. I wanted to see how she disrupted it. I wanted to see her imprint on the cushions, her presence filling the void I had carefully cultivated. I wanted the chaos she brought. She reached up to rub the back of her neck, tilting her head forward. The movement exposed the pale, vulnerable curve of her nape, usually hidden by her ponytail or the collar of her jersey. It was a soft, defenseless line on a body built for aggression. My fingers twitched against the cool glass of water I was holding. I had a sudden, violent urge to cross the room and place my hand there, to cover that vulnerability, to claim it. "I didn't think it would be this quiet," she said, her voice barely a whisper, not turning around. "It's like the city doesn't exist up here." "That's the point," I said. She turned to face me then, and the look in her eyes was unguarded. She wasn't analyzing my posture or looking for a weakness in my grip. She was just looking at me. The water from her clothes had begun to seep into her shirt, turning the gray fabric dark and clinging to her skin. She was shivering in earnest now, a physical reaction she couldn't suppress. "You're freezing," I stated, the observation cutting through the tension. It wasn't a question of professional courtesy anymore. It was a physiological fact. "I'm fine," she lied, her teeth almost chattering. "You're not," I countered, setting my glass down on the island with a sharp click that echoed in the silence. "And you can't stay in those clothes." I pointed her toward the bathroom, a space of stark white tile and chrome fixtures. She nodded and walked down the hall. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, and then the lock turned, a soft, mechanical barrier sliding into place. A moment later, the sound of the shower running cut through the silence of the apartment. It was a mundane noise, the rushing of water through copper pipes. But in the stillness of my curated sanctuary, it sounded intimate. I stood in the center of my living room for a beat, listening. I could visualize the scene with a clarity that felt dangerous. I knew exactly which handle she had turned, the left one for heat. I knew the water pressure was aggressive, a pounding rhythm against the tile. I imagined her stepping into the spray, the water sluicing away the grime of the city and the sweat of the match. The thought was a physical weight in my chest. Sloane, my professional partner, the woman whose form I critiqued with clinical detachment, was naked in my shower. The architectural separation of the wall between us felt impossibly thin. I turned away, breaking the trance, and walked into my bedroom. The air in here was cooler. I went to the dresser, my fingers trailing over the wood, before pulling open the second drawer. This was another violation of protocol. My clothes were organized by function. Technical fabrics for training, structured wool for meetings. But in the back, folded with precision, were the soft things. The things I wore when the world was locked out. I ran my hand over the stack of cotton t-shirts. Lending her clothes felt like a distinct escalation. Offering a towel is hospitality. Offering clothing is ownership. It is draping someone in your own skin. I bypassed the newer shirts, the ones that still held their rigid shape, and pulled out a charcoal gray tee. It was vintage, the cotton worn thin and impossibly soft from years of washing. It was oversized, a garment that swallowed my own frame. I knew how it smelled, like my laundry detergent and the faint, lingering trace of my own perfume. I walked back to the bathroom door. The water was still running, a steady, thundering cascade. I knocked, the sound sharp against the wood. "Sloane!" I called out, my voice pitching slightly to be heard over the noise. "Yeah?" Her voice came back muffled. "I'm leaving a shirt by the door," I said, "and a towel." "Okay. Thanks." I set the items on the floor right against the threshold and retreated to the kitchen. I needed distance. My attention remained fixed on that closed door. Then the water stopped. I heard the slide of the shower curtain, the soft pad of wet feet on the bath mat. I waited. The anticipation was a tight coil in my stomach, winding tighter with every passing second. The door creaked open. A plume of steam escaped first, rolling into the hallway like a physical presence. It carried a scent that stopped me in my tracks. It was the smell of my own body wash, a heavy, specific blend of sandalwood and bergamot that I had used for years. Smelling it now, billowing out from the bathroom where she had just used it, felt like a sensory short circuit. It was my scent, but it was attached to the heat of her body. Sloane stepped out of the fog. She had scrubbed her face clean. Her skin was pink from the heat, raw and glowing in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. Her hair was wet, slicked back from her forehead, darker now that it was saturated. Water droplets clung to the ends, dripping onto the shoulders of the gray t-shirt. The shirt changed her. On the court, Sloane is all compression gear and sharp lines. She is a statue of kinetic potential. But in the oversized cotton, she looks softer. The neckline slipped off one shoulder, exposing the sharp line of her clavicle and the damp skin of her neck. The hem hid her mid-thigh, leaving her legs bare. Her feet were naked against my floor. She looked up, catching me staring. She didn't flinch this time. She didn't posture. "It fits," she said, her voice dropping a register. "It's big," I corrected, though I couldn't look away. "It's warm," she countered. She moved toward the living room. The architecture of the apartment forced us into a proximity that felt dangerous. As she brushed past me, I didn't just smell the soap. I felt the heat radiating off her. It was a tangible wave of humidity, the kind of steam that rises from a body that has just been scalded clean. The air between us seemed to thicken, charged with the promise of contact. I could see the dampness of her skin, the way a single drop of water traced a path from her hairline down the side of her neck. My hand twitched at my side, a phantom impulse to reach out and stop that drop, to touch the heat source. I didn't move. I let her pass, the moment stretching out, breathless and heavy, until she stepped into the cooler air of the living room, taking the warmth with her. I bypassed the Italian leather couch entirely. It felt too rigid, too much like a waiting room for a high-stakes negotiation where one side inevitably loses. Tonight wasn't about negotiation. It was about the unraveling of terms. I set the bottle of Cabernet down on the thick wool rug in the center of the room. It was an instinctive decision to lower the center of gravity, to bring us down to the floor, where the air felt less thin and the pretenses harder to maintain. Sloane followed my lead without a word. She sat cross-legged opposite me, the oversized gray t-shirt pooling around her knees, exposing the smooth, pale skin of her thighs. I poured the wine. The liquid was dark, almost black in the dim light of the apartment, swirling into the crystal with a rich, heavy sound. I handed her a glass. Our fingers didn't touch. I was careful about that. But the transfer felt heavy, as if the glass weighed 40 pounds instead of 4 ounces. We drank in silence for a moment. The wine was bold, coating the tongue, warming the chest. It was the necessary solvent for the rusting gears of our usual dynamic. The rain was still drumming against the glass, but it felt distant now, a backdrop to the quiet storm brewing on the rug. "We don't talk," she said. It wasn't a question. She was staring into her glass, watching the red legs of the wine slide down the crystal. "We talk all the time," I countered, though I knew it was a lie before the words fully left my mouth. "We talk about spin," she corrected, her voice sharp but low. "We talk about court positioning. We talk about the business of winning." She looked up, her eyes dark and serious, stripping away the professional veneer. "We never talk about why we're the only 2 people left at the club every night. We never talk about what we're running from." It was a direct hit. The why was the dangerous part. The why was the hunger that drove the perfectionism, the void we filled with drills and exhaustion. "Control," I said simply. "It's about control. If I can perfect the shot, I can perfect the day." "Is it?" She took a long, deliberate sip. "I think it's about fear. Fear of being average. Fear of stopping long enough to realize you're lonely." She was dissecting me now, using the same sharp, analytical eye she used on an opponent's backhand. It was uncomfortable. It was thrilling. She saw the cracks in the porcelain. "And you?" I asked, deflecting the scalpel. "You play like you're trying to break the ball." Sloane swirled her wine, the liquid threatening to spill over the rim. "I play better when I'm angry," she admitted. "Or when I'm on the edge. I need the friction. If I'm comfortable, I get sloppy. You know that." I did know that. I had spent months managing that friction, keeping her right on the line between genius and disaster. But I hadn't realized until this moment that I was the source of the friction. "You've been playing angry all week," I noted. "Not angry," she corrected, her gaze locking onto mine. "Distracted. There's a difference." The word hung in the air. Distracted. In our world, distraction was the enemy. It was the thing that lost championships. But looking at her now, with her hair damp and my shirt slipping off her shoulder, I knew we weren't talking about the crowd noise or the wind. "The distraction is costing us points," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to frame it as a coaching problem. "The restraint is costing us more," she shot back. She set her glass down on the rug. The crystal made a soft, muffled thud. She leaned forward slightly, invading the space between us. The scent of my body wash on her skin was stronger now, mixed with the wine and the humidity of the room. "We can't keep doing this, can we? The staring, the avoiding, the pretending that the only tension between us is about the score." I looked at the wine left in my glass, a dark pool of hesitation. She was right. The architecture of our partnership was buckling under the weight of what we weren't saying. We had reached the crisis point. We could either reinforce the walls and suffocate, or we could let them collapse and see what survived the wreckage. "We can't keep doing this." The words hung in the space between us, stripping the room of its last defense. It was the first time in 6 months that we had spoken the truth without wrapping it in the safety of a sports metaphor. There was no net to catch this, no sideline to mark it out. It was a direct volley to the chest. I looked at her, really looked at her. The wine glass in her hand was steady, but her knuckles were white. Doing what? I asked, though I knew. I needed her to say it. I needed to know that the frequency I had been vibrating on for half a year wasn't a hallucination born of stress and proximity. The dance, Sloane said, her voice rough. The way we circle each other in the kitchen line. The way you check my grip pressure when you know it's fine. The way I wait for you to leave the locker room before I shower because I can't handle being in that steam with you if we aren't going to acknowledge it. She set her jaw, a stubborn, beautiful line I had seen 1,000 times across the net. In the locker room today, when you froze, you weren't looking at my shoulder injury. You weren't checking my hydration levels. No, I admitted, the word falling heavy like a stone. I wasn't. You were looking at me, she whispered, and I let you. The admission shattered the professional boundary we had signed our names to. We were partners. We had sponsors. We had a reputation for clinical efficiency. Crossing this line wasn't just a personal risk. It was professional suicide. If this went wrong, if we tangled our lives together and then unraveled, we would take the championship down with us. You can't play doubles with a ghost. You can't anticipate the movement of someone you can't look in the eye. We have the Nationals in 3 weeks, I said, the strategist in me making one last desperate stand. If we do this, if we complicate the dynamic, we risk everything. The synergy we have, it's fragile. It relies on a hierarchy. It relies on me being the head and you being the hand. If we blur that, the synergy is already broken, Sloane interrupted, leaning in. The gray t-shirt slipped further, a distraction I had to physically fight to ignore. That's why we almost dropped the second set today. You weren't trusting my calls because you were too busy trying not to touch me. You hesitated on the switch because you didn't want to be in my space. She was right. The precision I worshipped had been replaced by a terrified avoidance. I had been playing to keep a distance, not to win the point. The restraint I thought was discipline was actually a handicap. I thought I was protecting the game, I said, my voice quiet. You're suffocating it, she countered. I play on instinct. You know that. And right now, my instinct is screaming at me to close the distance, but I'm spending 90% of my energy fighting it. Imagine if I could put that energy into the ball. She looked down at her hands, those strong, calloused hands that could put a wicked topspin on a plastic ball, and then looked back at me with a vulnerability that wrecked me. I'm tired of fighting you, and I'm tired of fighting this. It's exhausting. And I think it's making us lose. The logic was sound. It was terrifying, but it was sound. The tension wasn't a fuel anymore. It was a friction burn. We were grinding our gears, burning out the engine before we even reached the finals. So what are you saying? I asked. That we just give in? That we treat this like a scratch we need to itch so we can get back to work? I'm saying we stop pretending the itch isn't there, she said. I'm saying we stop acting like two professionals who just happen to share a court and admit that the reason we win is because we are obsessed with each other. She moved her hand then. It was a small movement, sliding her fingers across the wool rug until they were inches from mine. I don't want to scratch an itch, Elle. I want to know why you looked at me in the mirror and didn't look away. I want to know if you felt the air pressure drop too. I looked at her hand. It was an invitation. It was a terrifying variable that I couldn't calculate. But looking at her, seeing the raw need in her eyes that mirrored my own, I realized the dataset had changed. The risk of doing nothing was now higher than the risk of doing everything. I didn't look away, I said, my voice steadying as the decision settled in my chest. Because I didn't want to. Then don't look away now, she challenged. The distance between us was no longer a safety zone. It was a gap that demanded to be closed. It was a realization that the only way out was through. The restraint was the error. The indulgence was the correction. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to abandon the strategy and just play the ball. Tonight, the kitchen line, that 7-foot strip of concrete we were forbidden to cross, was mapped onto a wool rug. We were both standing on the edge, toes hanging over the precipice. I watched her hand on the floor. It was resting inches from mine, relaxed but ready, the way it rested on her thigh before a serve. Her fingers were long, the nails kept short for the game. I watched her index finger trace a slow, idle circle on the fibers of the rug. The movement was hypnotic. It was a small, unconscious betrayal of the stillness she was trying to project, a leak in the containment vessel. Then the circle stopped. She reached out. It wasn't a grab. It wasn't aggressive. It was a test. Her fingers brushed against the back of my hand, a feather-light contact that sent a shockwave straight up my arm, seizing in my chest. I stopped breathing. The contact was tentative, a question asked in the language of skin. She waited, her fingertips resting against my knuckles, giving me the chance to pull away, giving me the chance to reestablish the perimeter I had spent 6 months patrolling. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. My biomechanics, usually so obedient, failed me. The signal from my brain to my muscles, withdraw, retreat, secure, was intercepted by a louder, primal command to stay. She slid her hand further, her palm covering mine. The sensation was shocking in its familiarity and its foreignness. Her skin was warm, dry, and rough. These were pickleball hands. I felt the ridge of calluses at the base of her fingers, the toughened skin built up from thousands of hours gripping a tacky handle, from absorbing the shock of a drive, from the friction of the game. It was a texture I knew intimately from my own body, but feeling it from her was a revelation. It wasn't the soft, manicured hand of a stranger. It was a tool of our trade. It was a hand that knew how to hold tension. It grounded me. It terrified me. I looked down at our joined hands on the dark rug. My own hand, usually steady enough to place a dink within an inch of the sideline, was shaking. It was a microscopic vibration, invisible to anyone else, but I felt it rattling the bones. I felt the loss of precision. The control I worshipped, the ironclad discipline that defined my career and my life, was dissolving under the heat of her palm. "You're shaking," she whispered. It wasn't an accusation. It was a wonder. "I'm not," I lied automatically, the reflex of a competitor refusing to show weakness. "You are." She tightened her grip, her thumb pressing into the soft space between my thumb and forefinger, finding a pressure point I didn't know existed. "I am too." I looked up at her face. The mask was completely gone. Her eyes were wide, the pupils swallowing the iris, searching mine for a sign. She looked terrified, but resolved. She looked like she was standing on the baseline, down match point, deciding to go for the winner down the line instead of the safe return. "The line," I murmured, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "We're crossing it." "The ball bounced, Elle," she said softly. "We're allowed to step in." She shifted her weight, moving her knees on the rug. The movement brought her closer, invading the personal space I guarded so jealously. She moved her other hand, placing it tentatively on my knee. The heat of her palm seeped instantly through the denim of my jeans, a brand of ownership. It was a casual touch, something partners might do in a huddle. But here, in the silence of my apartment, with the rain sealing us in, it felt electric. I took a deep breath. It was a ragged, shuddering inhale, the kind of breath you take before a tiebreaker, filling the lungs to capacity to steady the heart. I held it for a second, feeling the oxygen flood my system, and then I let it go. It was a surrender. I released the need to calculate the outcome. I released the fear of the error. I turned my hand over, interlocking my fingers with hers. The fit was perfect. Tight, strong, inevitable. I used the grip to pull myself forward, bridging the final gap between us. The movement was fluid, abandoning the rigid mechanics of the court for something softer, something desperate. I saw her eyes flutter shut as I moved into her space. I felt the heat of her breath against my lips, smelling of wine and anticipation. The strategy was gone. There was only the terrifying proximity of her, the collapse of the boundary, and the moment before the impact. I didn't hesitate. I leaned in and pressed my lips to hers. The kiss was not a collision. It was a slow, heavy release. The kind of structural failure that happens when a load has been bearing down on a support beam for too long, and the steel finally, inevitably, bends. It started tentative, a question asked against my mouth, but the answer was immediate. I felt the tension leave her body in a rush, a physical exhalation that mirrored my own. The months of professional distance, of tracking each other's movements across the court, of correcting form and counting reps while ignoring the heat rising under our collars, it all evaporated. She tasted of the Cabernet, dark and rich, and of something sharper. It was the taste of the adrenaline she lived on. Her hands, usually so disciplined in their grip on a paddle, were suddenly everywhere. One tangled in the hair at the nape of my neck, the calluses on her palm scraping gently against my scalp. The other hand gripped my waist, her thumb pressing into the oblique muscle with a familiarity that made my breath hitch. She knew exactly where to hold me. She knew the anatomy of my body better than anyone, because she had spent half a year studying it in motion. I pulled her closer, my hands bunching in the fabric of the oversized gray t-shirt I had lent her. The cotton was soft, worn thin by years of washing, a stark contrast to the hard, unyielding muscle beneath it. I felt the strength in her shoulders, the solid ridge of her deltoids under my palms. It was a heady, intoxicating mix, the softness of the domestic setting and the hardness of the athlete I knew her to be. We were two apex predators who had finally stopped circling and started colliding. We didn't make a conscious decision to move. It was a magnetic pull, a shift in gravity. The living room floor with its expansive rug and floor-to-ceiling windows felt too open, too exposed to the city lights bleeding through the rain. We needed walls. We needed the dark. I stood up, pulling her with me, our mouths separating only long enough to catch a ragged breath. The look she gave me then, pupils blown wide, lips swollen, the professional rival completely shattered, was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. We moved down the hallway to my bedroom, a space I guarded even more fiercely than my gym schedule. It was a room of shadows and silence, the air cool and still. But as we crossed the threshold, we brought the storm with us. The bed was low, the sheets cool against my skin as we tumbled onto them, a tangle of limbs and urgency. The heat between us was immediate but pervasive, a slow burn that seeped into the marrow. It wasn't the frantic, desperate fumbling of strangers. It was the deliberate, heavy friction of two people who understood the mechanics of resistance and release. When her skin brushed against mine, it felt like a completion. I ran my hands down the length of her back, tracing the spine I had watched flex under heavy overheads, feeling the way her muscles shifted and yielded under my touch. There is a terrifying vulnerability in letting someone who knows your strength see you weak. I pride myself on discipline, on never faltering under weight. But here, in the dark, with Sloane's weight pressing me into the mattress, I didn't want to be strong. I wanted to unravel. I wanted to let go of the control I held onto so tightly. And she let me. She met my intensity with her own, but she also offered a softness I hadn't expected. Her touch was demanding but reverent, exploring my body not as a machine to be optimized, but as a landscape to be known. Elle, she breathed my name, the sound lost against my skin. It was an admission of defeat in the best possible way. This wasn't just a hookup. I realized it with a jolt of panic that was quickly swallowed by the pleasure of her hands on me. The chemistry was too real, too sustainable. It wasn't just the physical release of pent-up rivalry. It was an alignment. We fit together with a terrifying exactness. The way she moved, the way she breathed, the way she anticipated my reactions. It was a language we were both fluent in, finally speaking it out loud. The morning sun didn't filter into the room. It assaulted it. The light was harsh, white, and unforgiving, slicing through the gap in the blackout curtains I had neglected to close fully. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air and exposed the chaotic, tangled wreckage of the sheets. It wasn't a romantic glow. It was a forensic light, revealing every detail of the night's indiscretion. I woke with a start, my internal clock screaming that the routine had been shattered. My hand shot out across the mattress, seeking the solid heat I had fallen asleep against, the anchor that had kept me grounded in the dark. My fingers met cool cotton. The space beside me was empty. The pillow still held the indentation of her head, a hollow proof of presence, but the warmth was fading. Panic, sharp and cold, flooded my chest. It was the immediate, sinking nausea of a mistake realized too late. She had left. She had woken up in the sobering, clinical light of day, looked at the reality of sleeping with her doubles partner 3 weeks before nationals, and fled back to the safety of the distance we maintained. The narrative wrote itself in my head. The regret, the awkward text message, the avoidance during drills. I had opened the fortress, and she had taken the first opportunity to escape. I swung my legs out of bed, ignoring the deep, unfamiliar soreness in my muscles that had nothing to do with lunges. I grabbed my silk robe, wrapping it tight like armor, and walked into the hallway. The silence of the apartment felt heavy again, accusing. I prepared myself for the empty living room, for the humiliation of having misread the permanence of the night. Then I smelled it. Coffee. Not the emergency pods I kept for guests I didn't want to stay, but the good beans, ground fresh. I turned the corner into the kitchen. Sloane was there. She was leaning against the quartz island, holding a ceramic mug with both hands. She was still wearing the vintage gray t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy, loose knot that defied the severe ponytail she wore on the court. She looked ridiculously domestic, like she belonged there. The sight of her standing in my kitchen, illuminated by the morning sun, felt more dangerous than the sex had. Intimacy in the dark is biology. Making coffee in someone's kitchen is a declaration of presence. She looked up as I entered. She didn't look guilty. She didn't look like she was planning an escape route. She looked steady. "I found the grinder," she said, her voice a little rough from sleep. "Hope that's okay." "You stayed," I said. It wasn't the eloquent morning greeting I had planned, but it was the only truth that mattered. "I told you," she replied, taking a slow sip from the mug, her eyes never leaving mine. "My car's in the shop, and I didn't want to go anywhere else." I walked over to the island. The distance between us was gone. The tension of the will we, won't we was replaced by the heavy gravity of we did. I poured myself a cup, the ceramic clinking softly against the counter. "We have court time in an hour," I said, leaning against the counter next to her. "We have the morning block with the coach." "I know." She turned to face me fully. The sunlight caught the line of her jaw, the place I had kissed hours ago. "It's going to be different. The dynamic, the way we move. We can't pretend it didn't happen," I said, my voice firm. "I don't do regression. I don't backtrack." "Good," she said, her gaze unflinching. "Because I'm not going back to the Cold War. I'm done fighting you for territory. It's exhausting. The rivalry, that sharp, exhausting architecture we had built to keep ourselves motivated and isolated, was effectively demolished. We couldn't go back to being apex predators circling each other. We knew too much now. I knew the sound of her breath when she let go. She knew the way my hands shook when I lost control. The mystery was gone, replaced by an alliance. "Alliance?" she suggested, a small, wry smile touching her lip. "Alliance," I agreed. She finished her coffee and set the mug down next to mine. The two circles of ceramic touching on the counter felt like a seal. "I need a shower," she said. "And I need to borrow something that isn't this shirt. Unless you want me training in your vintage loungewear." "I have some spare gear," I said. "It might be a little tight in the shoulders. I'll make it work." We moved apart to get ready, but the energy in the room had shifted. It wasn't the frantic heat of the night, but a steady, functional warmth. We were leaving the sanctuary, heading back to the war zone of the court. But for the first time, I wasn't going into battle alone. Walking onto the court felt like stepping onto a movie set after the cameras had stopped rolling. The air was the same, heavy with rubber and sweat, but the context had shifted. During warm-ups, I caught her eye across the net. She didn't look away. She held my gaze, a slow, knowing smirk touching the corner of her mouth. It wasn't the stare of a rival anymore. It was the shared secret of a partner. We had broken the rules to save the game. If you understand the tension of the unspoken game, subscribe for more stories.